Hey, looks like
Hey,
we're live.
everybody. Welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. This is Pastor Megan in San Francisco, gracesf.com. I think .com. It might be .org. I don't remember. It's the week after Easter. What about you, John?
John Stevens, pastor of Zion Lutheran in Oregon City, Oregon. We worship 10 a.m. communion every Sunday, and I say that every week because it's important to me, and so communion every Sunday. And there we go. Yeah,
Yeah, we're
yeah.
both not tired. I think
Nice.
maybe we need Pink Jesus to help us. I don't know.
Oh, that's
Thanks
almost
for
as good as
rising from the
last week.
dead, Jesus. We're really exhausted from all the worshiping we had to do to remember you. Okay.
Right.
We're
I,
glad you're back.
Yeah, thank you. I was all I have is the little frog.
Oh.
Yes, it's not Jesus, but anyway. So, oh yeah, so I
Baby.
can't reach my Luther, so there we are.
There you have it. Whenever Pastor Amanda's away, we decide to play with toys, which is really
Right,
fun.
that's
It's
true.
it's mostly just to make her feel bad for not being here, which I'm sure she's probably smarter than us at taking them out.
Fun without you. Anyway,
That's right.
I wonder why all my animals or my toys talk like this.
That's right.
Right.
Because this is the voice you're supposed to use.
Oh, okay. Right.
The turtle.
All right.
Oh, look, my council president's calling me. Sorry, Sally
Oh,
Ann. I'm going to ignore your call because we're doing Bible study that doesn't suck
look at
soon.
that. All right.
So, this is a fun Sunday. Couple interesting things. One, kind of the rough overview of the text, the Pastor Megan Crass version of talking about them. We have the John readings, which are about explaining to us the message of what it means that Jesus has risen from the dead, which is nice because if your pastor is tired from Easter, the texts do all of the work, which is lovely. We have the reading from John, which is called the Doubting Thomas text, but I think he kind of gets a bad rap.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah, kinda. Yeah.
yeah, because all Jesus comes to all of the disciples uninvited. I'm sure they were glad to see him. This is what's cool about the Gospel of John is very mystical, and so in this version, John answers questions like, when Jesus came back from the dead, was he a ghost? Was he tangible? Could you touch him? And so this story is awesome because Jesus both comes into the room without any doors being opened, right? So maybe some ghost-like features, and you can touch him. So it's like a both and. We have no idea what this stuff is that Jesus is made of. Maybe it's that mysterious manna that comes down from heaven in a liquid and then becomes a solid form.
Right, right. Like Terminator as the metal. Anyway, so.
Mm-hmm. So it comes in either through the walls or locks the door behind him when no one's paying
Right.
attention. It's hard to know. But Jesus lets everybody touch him, gives the Holy Spirit to people. And Thomas it's not like he's just sitting around being like, I don't believe that Jesus raised from the dead. What happens is this group of his friends are like, we saw him. He came here on the day when you were gone. And it's hard to know when a group of your friends are telling you a story that seems sort of far-fetched, if they're telling you the truth or if they're pulling your leg. And so there's this moment where Thomas is saying, I'm not going to believe it until I can touch it too, which maybe he was jealous, but honestly, the nerve of Jesus to show up when one dude was missing.
Well, I mean,
So
it's like in Thomas, all we know is, I mean, I always view it's like Thomas is out getting donuts for the rest of the disciples,
I know
and he,
everyone's so afraid they can't leave the room, and he was brave enough to leave, and he misses the coolest thing ever.
yeah, yeah.
Poor
So, I mean,
Thomas.
pointing out with the John text, I mean, we get this text the week after Easter every year because it's the text that has us a week after Easter. The first day
Mm-hmm.
of the week, and this is for us. It's like that one text we have that it says, "Hey, this happened right after Easter." So we get this text every. If you're on the RCL narrative lectionary, we were doing the end of Matthew. So
Oh, that's fun.
yeah. So, and which has a great line in there where when Jesus appears and he says, and the disciples, it says the 11 disciples, because it kind of a hint about that they're missing one of their disciples. The 11 disciples, they go to Galilee, they go to the mountaintop, and Jesus appears, and it says, and they worshipped, and the disciples worshipped, yet some doubted. And I love that. I mean, and again, it kind of pulls back into this John text. We have this doubting Thomas that we think. I don't know about you, when someone says doubting Thomas, a lot of times they'll say that as a negative thing. Hey, that doubting Thomas, if I was there. Is it Nowen, or is it Nowen that says that doubt is the ants in the pants of faith?
I'm going to agree with you, because it sounds smart if we both do the same thing.
But I love it, because it's like, the doubt gets us to look, propels us into it's like that trampoline of faith.
Yeah, and it makes us be able to have a real conversation rather than just repeating what we heard from other people or pastors or whatever is up. And people who, what we talked about a little bit at the Easter service at Grace, is that we come from a long line of people who haven't had a lot of confidence in every single word of the Lord's Prayer, or every single word of the Nicene Creed, or every single word of, God forbid, the Athanasian Creed, which is really out there. And as Lutherans, which John and I are, we don't believe you have to believe every single word, every single moment of every single day, that we have faith that God is able to love us and name us and claim us even when we don't know the right answers to pop quiz questions, and even when we don't behave the right way, and even when we don't believe every single word of a creed. And there's this thing called the community of saints, which we rely on. This week is the feast week of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who wrote a really good doctoral dissertation on the community of saints. It's complicated and has a lot of Latin in it, so it's not very accessible to most folks. So the Cribs Note version of Sanctorum Communio is this idea that we're all in it together. You don't have to believe every word of the creed because you're a part of a faith community. And the faith community believes in the creed, and in our saying it together, if you whisper parts of it, you're not going to be able to notice unless it's a teeny tiny church, because by our all syncing our breaths up and getting in the same spirit of faith together, we can rest on the hearts of the ancestors who did believe all these things very deeply. It's kind of like when kids are forced to go to Sunday school and go to church based on the faith of their parents. They don't want to go at all, and they wonder why it matters, because if they don't believe, what good does it do for me to go into the church space? And in baptism, when we're baptizing babies, we don't care that the little bitty baby can't say yes or no to whether or not they like Jesus, or whether or not someday they're going to like the Athanasian Creed. They get to borrow the heart of the people around them in the community, and the community is pledging to be in relationship with them and to struggle with them and to learn about faith with them in all the stages of their life. So there might be days when you are really digging the Athanasian Creed, and that's really strong for your faith, and you're just as much a part of the community as the people who are like, I don't even know what the word Athanasian is, or what it means. And so we're in it together, basically.
Yeah, two things. One, a story when you were talking about before about, because I want to go back to the Athanasian Creed in a second, but you mentioned about, we as Lutherans, this idea that we won't have to answer the pop quiz, or, if we had the about faith. When I was in Juneau as a pastor there, one of my confirmation students, who is now married and way beyond. Anyway, but in 9th grade, she was talking about how she had friends who asked her, so when you are when you die, you go to heaven, and God asks you the question, why should I let you in? What will you say? And so here's Amanda, who says, I looked at my friends and said, my God doesn't ask me those kind of questions. And it was just a fantastic one of those. I mean, it was like, I was like, you pass. It was just a great, wonderful thing. My God doesn't ask me those kinds of questions, because I've been in relationship with my God from the very beginning, and my God knows me. And why would my God have to ask me something as silly as that? It was just great. So
yeah. And if God does ask you that, a really good answer is, because you're God and I'm not.
Right, yeah,
let me in.
Yeah, please let me in. the back with the Athanasian Creed. Okay, so we've talked about the Apostle and the Nicene Creed. So, Megan, for those who are listening in, what the hell is the Athanasian Creed?
I have no idea. No, all of the different creeds that we have in the church are different moments when a group of Christians, mostly men, mostly powerful men, got together and they said, the least things that we can agree on are these things. Let's write them down to go back to our communities so we don't war with each other and be able to prevent ourselves from fighting. Let's try to get along because this is the minimal things that we can agree on. And so the Nicene Creed was a time when they were in Nicene, get it? The Apostles' Creed, they weren't in the Apostles, but they were kind of talking about what God is up to. And most of these creeds are just trying to figure out, very much like what John is up to, what is the substance of God? What is God made of? How was God created? When was God present? The Gospel of John says that Jesus is the words that were spoken at the beginning of creation and was always around, and it talks about the relationship that the different essences, the different manifestations, the different ways that we have of expressing the way God has different jobs in the world, how they come to be. And so some of them go into greater detail. Some of them are just like, if you need to know the story of Jesus, here's the fast and dirty way to say it. And that's kind of the Apostles' Creed. The Athanasian Creed, I think, is the one that's really confusing because it's like John wrote it. It's like, and then this was actually flesh, and this one was skin, and this one was spirit.
The thing I like about the Athanasian Creed, which we never say in church because it would be like in the place of the sermon because it's so long. But the thing I like about the Athanasian Creed is, we'll talk to folks about the Trinity and the Trinity being 3 in 1, 1 in 3, blah blah blah, and the blah 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 is the important theological term, by the way. But what I like about the Athanasian Creed is that it lets me know that we aren't the only ones that have struggled with the idea of the Trinity. Looking at how do we explain this, and so the Athanasian Creed is all about, all right, let's figure out how we can explain the Trinity, which it really anytime we try to explain the Trinity beyond it's a mystery, we fail. But I like that idea in the sense that you read this and go, at some point, even these church fathers, even these large, important dudes or whatever, they struggled with the idea of, okay, so how do we explain this doctrine of faith? And so, I'm looking at the text. I'm transitioning, unless
let's look at the text. I'm going to post a copy of the Athanasian Creed down here if you're interested.
All right, just in case
Wikipedia link.
Sneaky material or something like that.
In case you don't have it memorized, like we clearly have it.
Right.
Memorized.
When I'm
when I'm bored on trains, I'm
the Athanasian Creed.
Just reading the Athanasian Creed again.
Right. Sometimes in council, when I space out, and they're like, "What are you thinking about?" Oh, I'm sorry, I was just thinking about the Athanasian Creed. So this John text also, some folks would say that this John text is also John's Pentecost story. Spirit comes, because you have Luke Acts, you've got the Pentecost story where the Spirit is given, but here where in 21 where Jesus says to them, peace be with you, and then when he had said this, he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. I mean, what a wonderful...
Which seems kind of gross. It's kind of like during communion on Sunday where I got a fit of the coughs and I felt really bad because I was getting my germs everywhere, but this feels like a lovelier version. Like, breathing on them was like good.
Right, you're right. This is a lovelier version of that, yeah.
Sorry, everyone at Grace, I didn't mean to. So
but and I love. There's something very comforting about that text where it's like, here the disciples locking themselves in this room out of fear and all that, and then Jesus comes and in his words, in that very presence, peace be with you. This is a section of the text that I find comfort. Yeah.
I like it. I like the last couple of verses, like 29 through 30, because you could think of it a couple ways. It talks about Jesus performing many signs for them, and you could think about that as, like, in my imagination, I think of it as like the X Factor, like Jesus performing like magic show for people to be like, look how great I am, and now that I've risen from the dead, I'm 25% more absorbent, or whatever, right? But I
Right.
imagine it's probably more like when people go to camp, or when people go on retreat. Every year I go on retreat with a group of pastors, and it's always awkward the first day because there's new people, and then there's old people who've been on retreat for many, many years in a row, and they have all these jokes and stories. And so there's this moment where the new people are like, I'm afraid I don't know if I can be a part of this group. And there's inevitably like this moment where you're all around a campfire and people are telling stories, and it starts off being this thing where you start off feeling really socially awkward, or really scared, or really nervous about what's going to happen. And then at some point, maybe someone sings a song and other people kind of get to be a part of it, or you kind of hit your groove where it kind of becomes like a talent show instead of like being nervous about who's judging you. Like, you can sing your really bad song and not care anymore because you've broken through this wall of anxiety. And so I like to imagine that that's what's going on in this big scary room. Is it might have started off where Jesus is like the little kid who comes down when everyone's worried about something, and they say, you want to see the song I've been working on in my room? And you pay attention at first because you feel obligated because you love this kid. But then after a while, you're all having fun and you've forgotten what you were so anxious about. So I like to imagine that Jesus not only comes into the room and gives Thomas the opportunity to see and feel what's going on so that he can be a good witness when he has to go and evangelize later, but that Jesus also kind of breaks that fear in the room and allows people to be a little bit more comfortable again, even if they're still afraid that people are going to slaughter them for being a part of this social rebellion and religious rebellion. That they at least had this moment of like laughing and connecting and bonding, and
Right.
that's how I like to think of it, a warm fuzzy
Yeah.
campfire.
One of the couple of things I'm looking at the text that kind of stand out. That I find it interesting that there's a week the week passes. You know, they're in the upper room. They're there for a week, and they're in the upper room. Doors are locked out of fear. And then a week later, his disciples were again in the house, and although the doors were shut, and so we don't know if they've been out and about, but it's this idea that they're still in the same house, in that same room. They probably weren't trapped, locked in there the entire week, but still, it's I don't know, just that point.
It's substantial, yeah.
Yeah, but also that for folks reading the text, John can come off as the Gospel of John can come off as pretty anti-Semitic with his use of the word Jews, and so. One of the helpful things is when you're reading John, you could almost say they were locked for fear of the religious authorities. And so John uses that word Jews as, because the folks that are gathered in that room, they're Jewish. Right. I mean, so we got where he uses that title, not in an anti-Semitic way, but as giving the religious authorities of that time. Some folks say that's letting John off too easy, but I think that's how he's using it. So that's what I say.
Yeah, and I think you can spend all your time being mad about how it was written, or you can spend your time critiquing that you're mad how it was written, but then moving on and actually kind of delving with the stories. And as pastors, we're kind of paid to do that, because if we just every Sunday were like, John's anti-Semitic, they'd be like, can you tell us about Jesus, please? Because
right, yeah.
I'd like communion. So that's a good text. And what I love is that there are lots of different ways that the 4 different Gospels talk to us about how the disciples respond to what's up. We know the one thing is for sure, they don't respond as well as the women do. The women get it more right than the disciples, and the disciples seem to need a little help. One of the things that's also true about the four different gospels is that the way Jesus's ministry got started is as varied as the way these disciples' ministries will get started. So in the Gospel of Mark, a baptism gives him the courage to go and be the Messiah in the world. In I can't remember if it's Matthew or Luke. I think it's maybe Matthew. The wedding of Cana, his mom says, "Come on, son, it's time to start behaving like the Messiah. Why don't you make some wine happen?" And so there are different ways that Jesus is pushed into the world. John's gospel, maybe Jesus has a little bit more courage because he's a mystical being that was there at the beginning of creation, and of course everything is one and very Zen-like with the way Jesus is out there in the world. But I like that same diversity in how people get started and what they're up to is replicated for how the disciples get moving afterwards. Some of them, Mark, we don't really get the chance to understand what's up with the disciples. It kind of leaves us with the impression that the women who were there are the disciples. John's gospel, they need to see and touch in order to have some feeling like they know what they're up to. And then in the Acts text that is read as the first reading for this Sunday is one of my favorites as someone who's worked with the homeless a lot. If you are someone who is afraid of words like communism, skip this reading, because I don't know how else to describe it, and it's not coming necessarily from a political space. Acts, if you'll remember, is the second half of Luke, so this is the way the Lucan gospel is trying to figure out what the disciples are up to, and their way of figuring it out is to try to live it out together in community, and to do the best they can to try to live it out together in community. And the way that they're trying to do that is by sharing their possessions and making sure that everyone who is in need has the things that they need. Luke's gospel is very interested in what's going on with the people who are poor, and really has a lot of great lines where Jesus is telling people to take care of the poor. And so I kind of feel like if Jesus came back during this moment when they're all sharing their things and everything is perfect, in a way that my cynical heart can't believe actually happened, that Jesus would have been really proud of them. And so I like the way the story in Mark ends with people not doing what they're supposed to, and then Luke also gives us a version of the story where people did do what they were supposed to, even if it was just for this one moment of time when they believed in their heart and their soul, and they didn't have private ownership, and they were sharing things, and everyone was housed, and everybody had enough food, and that really would be an expression of what messiahship is supposed to be, teaching people how to live that way, but also reminds us that the responsibility of making sure that the resurrected Jesus's work gets done in the world means we got to get along with our neighbors. We got to share our stuff. We've got to worry less about our possessions, which I don't know how to do that in our given economy and political system. But it still is something that I think this Acts text is leaving with us to say, we're not there yet. I mean, I think it's a way of saying they did it great as a way of critiquing we're not there yet, and we need to keep working on it. So I love the diversity.
Yeah, it's almost a mirror that you can hold up and say, and that's one of the, like, looking at the Didache or writings of Justin Martyr, some of the early churches, like, this is what the earliest apostles did. When we look at our worship and say, this is, and I love how some of those things, like offering for the poor, has always been a crucial part of Christian worship and Christian community. And so, looking at this text and go, however this actually got played out, like you said, my cynical heart goes, this might have been a pie in the sky thing. Yeah. Oh, let's all do this, because we also look at some of Paul's writings, and we go, yeah, the early Christian church was just like us. We were butting heads over everything. But I do like that there are certain things here that go, these are core values of our community from the very beginning, and taking care of one another is a core value.
Yeah. Well, there's also this interesting thing. If you are the kind of Christian who believes in evolution, as I do, then that the theory of evolution is that it's the survival of the fittest and the survival of the best. that doesn't happen in our Christian story. If you think about it, the best Christians, the ones who are living the way Jesus taught them to, get massacred shortly in this same time period. The ones who are willing to go out and proclaim the message get slaughtered in ways that look horrible unless they're on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Then they look kind of beautiful and romantic in retrospect. So what does it mean that we, in our evolution of Christianity, are descended from the Christians who maybe didn't get it and didn't live their faith in the best way and hid it under a bushel all the time? And so how do we evolve our faith and evolve the way we treat our neighbor when our history, as ancient as it might be, meant that those who were very good at faith got punished? And there's a book by a gentleman whose last name is Lehman. I'm trying to remember his name. I think it's Paul Lehman. He was of the Presbyterian variety, and he has this amazing book about how Christianity evolves, where he talks about revolutions eating their young. That the first person to say something and to really get a movement going gets killed. Right? If we think of some of the great minds, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King Jr., like a lot of people who are ahead of their time get in really big trouble. Mm-hmm. And even presidents who have said, let's try this thing, even if it turns out 100 years later we're so grateful that the president tried that thing, during their day they often get in a lot of trouble, or artists. And so thinking about how do we live and how do we participate in a community where those who have the best ideas, those who are the closest to God, are usually the ones that will get destroyed in our process of becoming and in our process of realizing God's vision in this world. And that's such a hard thing. If you've ever been in a work situation where when you're doing well, your coworkers get really jealous, or they just try to sabotage you, or if you've ever been in a relationship where the closer and more intimate you get with your partner, the more they do dumb things to see if you'll still like them after they do dumb things. I'm not going to say that it's human nature, but I think we all have experiences where we can relate to feeling like our doing our best got punished, or where our living out our truest self got punished. And when I read this Acts text, I also think, if I stopped believing in private ownership, other people are going to take advantage of me. So it's this wondering of who's going to have the guts to be the first to try this. And I think what we've learned is that individuals who try to give up all of their possessions and help other people, because I know several homeless people who really live this out in every moment of their life, and I wish they would live it out less, because they literally give everything that's ever given to them away, even the things that could provide them with a stable house or enough food or knowing where something's going to happen tomorrow. They give it out anytime they see someone in need, and that means they don't have anything to depend on for themselves. So individually, when we try to live this out, it doesn't always work the best. Some faith communities that give up their individual possessions, I think of like sisters and monks, and priests aren't required to give up all of their possessions. But depending upon the kind of vowed community, and there's a lot of progressive intentional communities where people live in co-ops together, and they might share food that comes out of a garden and share babysitting. We had a lot of hippie experimentations with trying to live in community, and for some people that worked amazingly well, and for other people that didn't work amazingly well. And then dealing with things like addiction that pop up in the midst of these communities becomes really difficult in figuring out how to live. And so it's just been a long experiment that I think people are still trying to figure out. How do we share what we have? How do we love even one person, let alone a whole community? How, as a church community, do we spend our money? What does our budget look like? And it's such a sticky wicket, because the economic divides between sharing money is as deep as our political divides. And if you sometimes listen to the debates between Republicans and Democrats, you'll hear the fight happening. Are we too generous Do we need to worry about our individual possessions? Is it bad when we give our things away? And the truth is that sometimes it is bad when we give too much away and when we give too much. And sometimes it's bad when we keep too much. And I think the dance of Christianity is figuring out, like Aristotle talks about it being a golden mean in Nicomachean Ethics. He talks about excess being a downfall because you can be addicted and it can drive you to ruin, and abstinence, complete abstinence of anything, can be a downfall, because Aristotle believed, like, if you didn't drink at all, you couldn't have fun at parties, and if you didn't ever have a sexual life, you couldn't understand that kind of intimacy. That doesn't mean some people aren't drawn to abstinence, but for the most part, he's saying somewhere in the middle, trying to figure out what's appropriate for you in your sex life, in your faith life, in your money life, trying to find that delicate dance of what is ethical, is kind of what we're left doing in this post-resurrected, God floated up to the sky world. How do we treat our neighbors fairly? How do we treat ourselves fairly? And that's, we kind of all have to figure it out, and we have different places on the spectrum, and we're working it out, and there's no right answers. But if we had right answers, we would be best-selling authors. Even just thinking we had right answers can make you a best-selling author or a fancy pants famous person. So,
well, and the struggle is that no matter how we try to live this out, we're left with the fact that we're still dealing with a bunch of humans, you know, and
we're still us at the end.
These fallible. When you're talking about martyrs, and you know the early Christian church, the best Christians, how they ended up being killed, that even the martyrs were able to take that to the extreme, that somehow if you weren't martyred for your faith, then you weren't the best Christians, because, and they made martyrdom into a work. You know, it's like, you know, the proof that you were a good enough Christian is that you would be killed for your faith, and so, you know, all that works out into our story about. I mean, humans can make someone feel guilty about anything. You know, I mean, it's like, oh, you didn't die for your faith. You know, and
and we do that too. Like I'm thinking of people who survived the HIV and AIDS crisis, people who had that disease. All they wanted was to find health in their life, and yet people who have lived 20 years feel guilty that they lived 20 years and can't figure out why other people didn't. I know people who are female pastors, and they felt like they didn't struggle enough because they missed this time when women pastors were brand new, and all of the female pastors wanted was a time when the women pastors wouldn't have to struggle enough, or wouldn't have to struggle to be a part of this new thing. And so I think it's such a weird thing, because when we live through suffering, we understand how unfair it is and how we would never wish it on anyone else, even if it provides us the best consequences, notoriety, or understanding ourselves in new ways that we wouldn't have if we didn't go through those things. We still wouldn't wish it on other people, but there's this strange thing when some people have the wisdom that comes from living through suffering. There's some wondering, do we have to go through that too? Do I have to replicate that in order to prove that I'm good enough or strong enough? And if I shout it from the rafters, all the same things that got other people martyred, but no one wants to kill me, then who am I? Who am I to think less of myself? And so, but I mean, that's the silly way that anxiety and depression works in our society, is we can feel bad about anything. And for some of us, it's based in the tangible realities of what's going on in our world, and for other people it's based on chemicals that we don't have control over, or fluctuations in how much sun we get to see, whether or not we can kind of feel strong and good about the world. And so I kind of think as big a mystery as the substance of God, or how this Trinity thing works, is the mystery of how we work, and how our emotions work, and how love works, right? That, I mean, you could spend your whole life being the best neighbor to everyone else in the world, and it still might feel like crap or not work right because people might misunderstand your intentions or be crappy back to you. And it's such a weird cosmos. It's so crazy. Like, and it makes me think God's even more mysterious for having come up with this wackadoodle place that we live on.
Yeah, well, speaking of mystery,
Mystery.
the second lesson, First John.
Yeah.
Yeah, the First John. So what is it? It's a narrative lectionary. We don't have it, but it looks First John 1 to almost 1 to 2. You know, I mean, chapters 1 and a little bit of chapters 2. I love First John 1:5, and you can definitely see why we named this First John. I mean, coming out of, but this is the message we heard from him and proclaimed to you, that God is light, and in God there is no darkness at all. And I love it. I mean, it's just talking about the mystery and the mystery of love, mystery of God. I mean, in the sense, now granted, this text, I mean, we could probably spend an entire episode on this, because I mean, John tells us, it's like, if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. And for those of us that it's part of our traditional confession, if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. But if we confess our sins, God, who is faithful and just, will forgive our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. I love it. I mean, that for me, those are words that's comfort. It's a combination. It's a two-edged sword. It's convicting and it's comfort that I know I mess up. But then at the beginning of chapter 2, my little children, I'm writing these things to you so that you may not sin. Excuse me, teacher.
You just said that's impossible.
Yeah, didn't you just say? But then he goes on again. But if anyone does sin, which we know we mess up, we have an advocate with the Father, and Jesus Christ the righteous. And we can go into and then he goes on to, we can talk about the theory of atonement, blah, 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 blah. But it's comfort me. I mean, I like the sense that it's like we mess up. And, I know that we'll get into conversations about, it's like all about, Christianity is all a bunch of don'ts and it's a set of rules. And for me, that I live in this community, it isn't about a bunch of don'ts. It's about how do we live our lives together, and the reality that we mess up, the reality that I mess up, and I'm still loved in spite of that, That's right. And I think some days I push that to a limit. Some days I'm like, what? You guys still love me? Yeah. Oh, the joke's on you. I mean, it's like, yeah. So.
Yeah, and I think too, this text is meant to be comforting. It's meant to be humbling. It's meant to remind us that, we all have things about us that make us wonder when we look in the mirror, whether they're on the inside or on the out. And we all have things that we wish we didn't do when we were younger, and we all have things that we wish we hadn't said at parties. One thing, kind of like when we were looking at the John text about the way the language about Jewish people was written into the text, that anti-Semitism that is there. There's some really great things that you can read about how, even though all this light and the darkness stuff is lovely and an amazingly beautiful poem, it has also done some damage in the world when it has been coupled with racism that has argued that lightness is good or whiteness is good and that darkness is bad. And so don't lose the poetic metaphor and think too deep about it, but also as a companion to these readings, this is a great opportunity to listen to some of the writings of African American scholars, of Muharista scholars, of Native scholars who have seen what happens when colonization happens, when we go to other places where we've decided that people are not smart enough to have their own understanding of God and their own language for God and their own stories for God, and we want to make sure that they confess for all the things that we've decided that they should confess for. And I think that's a long road of atonement right there. I think we could spend a whole month every second of the day repenting for a different way that Christianity's past has ignored the sovereignty of people, ignored the personhood of people, whether it's ways that we steamrolled and massacred and were unhelpful in, well, let's just say evangelizing in a way I think Jesus wasn't really talking about. I think Jesus wanted the good news to be shared, and Jesus told the disciples, when someone doesn't agree with you, shake the dust off your feet and leave the community. He never said slaughter them in Exodus and make sure that they repent the right way, or set them on fire and tell them they're witches. So we got to keep the spirit of what's in the text, like this idea that light in the darkness is a lovely thing. It's not possible to hold that poem in your hand and punch someone with the other one. Like, it's just, let's stick with the beauty and the mystery of what's going on, and let's try to be jerks as little as possible.
Well, and further down in the First John text, where it says, now by this we may be sure that we know him if we obey his commandments. And when for some it might automatically go all the way back to the Ten Commandments. But yet, I think for them they're going back to Christ, where Jesus says, "I give you a new commandment," and that's that you're to love one another, love each other as you love yourselves. And if we spent our time living that out, and even trying to live out the commandment of loving ourselves, and then moving into that about how do we love one another. I think, like you said, you can't hold the light and the darkness in the worst metaphor of, like, I'm better than you because I'm white and you're black, and you can't hold that in that hand and then hold in the other hand this, if we obey his commandment to love one another. They just don't. You have to look at it as the poem of light and darkness. It just doesn't. The text doesn't let you do anything else. So.
And it's a time where we're acknowledging that as much as we do the best we can with Bible study that doesn't suck, we come to these texts from the perspectives that we have, from the life that we have, and it's not our intent to negate anyone else's experiences. And also, I'm hopeful in this next year I want to try to find some ways to bring in, for some special conversations, voices that we haven't been able to engage yet. And so if you're someone who might be interested in some special Bible study that doesn't suck opportunities to talk about how Black Lives matters in our scripture readings, or how we can think about, I've been thinking about one of my professors from college, from Augustana College, Professor Ann Peterson, has a book called God, Creation, and All That Jazz. And it's about how we can be improvisational in our worship experiences to kind of mirror the spirit of the Reformation, and to mirror the fact that the Holy Spirit is less scripted than many of our church services are. And so finding ways that we can have additional conversations that expand our voices, because we do know our own limitations, and we hope that you'll add your voice to what we're up to, because
it reminds me of Robert Smith, my Gospels professor at PLTS, at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, and when he would talk about, he was invited many times to take part in the historical Jesus seminar, the Jesus seminar, and he would say, he goes, he always declined the invitation, and he said, because that's not a game he plays. And then he would explain that that's not a negative thing. That when he says that, he goes, everybody plays a game. We all come to these texts, we all come to things with a set of rules that we live by. And so, like you said, we come to these texts as Lutheran Christians, as I have experiences that that you don't, you have experiences that I don't, and then that doesn't mean that our ways of reading this is the only correct way, but it's the rules of the game that we bring to these, and it's just, and we get to play. That's the fun part. I like
That's right.
playing. Yeah.
Well, and it's like the Psalm 133, as short as it is, all 3 verses. How good and pleasant it is when the kindred live together in unity, and we get our beards filled with oil. Do you like your beard full of oil?
Oh, it's so fantastic.
And that it's like the dew of the mountains of Zion. And I just like this idea that I feel like this psalm has to be this short because the way to agree is to say less. It's kind of like if you ever took like a language class in school and there was always an essay section and you'd always get deductions based on the things you did wrong, and what you would learn is the longer your essay, the more opportunities you had to get something wrong, to screw it up. And the shorter you kept it, the more likely you were to really get your grammar correct. And so I think I love that. Like the Pentecost moment where everyone agrees that this sentence is the sentence that illuminates God for everyone. You can't write it down because then you would disagree. So right. I like this idea of being so excited that we are dwelling together and that we are community together, but we got to keep it short lest we say something wrong and screw it up again.
Well, that first verse of Psalm 133 is a great way to almost wrap the whole thing up today, but how very good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity.
Yeah. Keep working on that, because that's hard. And so but if all that you do, right, isn't that a song? If all that we do is learn to love and to be loved, that's the greatest thing. So keep working on that, and God will be with you, and you can't shake him off. God is like, I don't know,
the hound of heaven. Yeah.
The hound of heaven. That sounds scary.
Yep. So.
Anyway, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, John. It's good to see you.
Good to be back.
Out there, take your naps, Pastor Amanda.
Yeah.
Good job sneaking out. You were smart. Anyway, take care, everybody.
Yep.